Hello and welcome to episode 214 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Perrodin, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum here at Camp Shelby. And with me, as always, is my esteemed co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore of Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many other assignments. How are you this fine morning, Bill?
I'm doing great, Seth. Yesterday, I had the privilege, and it really was a true privilege, of speaking to the Maritime Patrol Association symposium, and I was their heritage speaker, invited to speak about the USS Indianapolis, which I was so delighted to do. But I also took the opportunity to talk about VP squadrons, and in fact, they were called VPB squadrons during World War II. You know, whether it was the PBYs or the Venturas, all these other squadrons that occurred that operated in the Pacific during World War II. And I talk about the vast array of missions that these naval aviators conducted during the war, not just bombing missions, VPB, but CSAR missions, of course, surveillance and reconnaissance, support to the coast watchers. And, you know, just incredible how many different things these aviators did during the war. And it was such a privilege to talk about all this to a group of admirals, commodores, captains, commanding officers in the modern VP community.
Yeah, the VPs played a significant role during our war that we talk about, obviously. You know, and one of the cooler squadrons, or not squadrons, but one of the cooler formations of VPs where we've talked about them in previous episodes, and we'll talk about them again, were the Black Cats. I don't know how many Black Cat pilots or crewmen are still alive today, but I do know of one. We got the sad news just a couple days ago that now there is only one USS Arizona survivor still with us as of April 27th, 2023, and his name is Lou Conter. Lou Conter was a survivor from the USS Arizona on December 7th, 1941, and he's a friend of mine. I haven't spoken to him in several years, but I knew him quite well back in my days at World War II Museum. But he, after his service aboard Arizona and his, you know, frankly, lucky survival, he was assigned to go to Pensacola to learn how to fly as an enlisted man. And once he got his wings, he became just that. He was a Black Cat pilot, and he flew missions out of in the South Pacific in late 42, early 43, and really for the remainder of the war. So he's one of those guys that kind of had a he saw the war literally from the first day till damn near the end, and we're lucky that he's still with us. He's the last surviving Arizona crewman and a Black Cat pilot, which is pretty cool.
So was he commissioned, Seth? Because we eventually transitioned all the enlisted pilots to commissioned officer pilots, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Now he took his flight training as an enlisted pilot, as an enlisted man, and after he got his wings, he was promoted to officer grade. He was an ensign, and I think he retired as a lieutenant commander. He spent, you know, a career in the United States Navy, and he saw a lot of war. Oh,
and he was in the middle of so much. My goodness, talk about, you're there on the first day, December 7th, and survive the Arizona. My goodness, that alone is enough to put you in the history books. And then he ended up down in the Solomons and flying Black Cat missions there and throughout the war. That's an incredible range of accomplishments for a single individual.
It is, and he's a hell of a guy too. He's first class individual, first class.
The one survivor of the Arizona, and as we're recording this, one survivor of the Indianapolis, Harold Boy of Benicia, California.
Sure enough.
And as we recorded on the spot, July 6th to 9th, we're going to be doing a reunion out there in Benicia and taking a tour of Mare Island Naval Shipyard, where the Indianapolis had its last refit. So a lot going on in the coming months, Seth.
And indeed, quite a bit. And we're definitely busy on the outside of the podcast, and we're also busy on the inside of this podcast. And we've got an interesting topic, to say the least, that we're going to talk about today. Some interesting people, interesting group. And it's quite ironic. This was not done on purpose at all, that this is episode 214. And we are going to be talking about a unit with that very same distinction here as we go along. So, you know, there are a handful of historical names that when mentioned almost instantly bring up a mental image, a memory from childhood, a game you used to play in your backyard, models you built as a kid or an adult, dreams of adventure, et cetera, et cetera. You know, we all had those dreams when we were young boys and young girls too at some point. Those names, places, groups, what have you, are usually legendary in history for many reasons, good and sometimes bad. Those legendary mental images or portraits are more often than not surrounded by myth, sometimes intrigue, sometimes fanciful tales, and even other times outright lies. The military has legendary names, just like the civilian world. These names are usually units or leaders, individual heroes, or a parcel of heroes. Names of men like Manila John, the Bull, Chesty, Doss, Mush, Swede, Jig, and Ching. Units like the 82nd Airborne, 101st Airborne, Big Red 1, Rock of the Marne, the Old Breed, Big E, Lucky A, Merrill's Marauders, and so on and so on and so on. However, in the Pacific War, one name and one unit stand above most when it comes to legend. The unit's leader was a legend in his own time, to both friend and foe, a hard-charging, hard-drinking renegade who led by example and was loved by all who flew with him. His persona then and now was surrounded by lore, more often than not, all too true. The unit he led was an ordinary fighter squadron that provided extraordinary results in a short period of time and provided countless campfire stories to generations of young boys who admired their exploits from afar. Me. Like Manila John, the Bull, and Chesty, and units like the 82nd, Big Red 1, the Big E, all legends in their own right. This leader and his unit also carved their way into history. They are, of course, Pappy and his black sheep. Now, Bill, this is a unit that, you know, there was a TV show made about them, which was horrible. But
that's the only way I learned about these guys back in I think it was the 70s. That horrible TV show.
It was horrible.
You know, go ahead.
I was going to say, when the History Channel first came out back in the, I guess the early 90s, I guess it was, they used to play reruns of Black Sheep Squadron, and I watched them, you know, and I mean, I knew a little, I'd read Pappy's book, which is, we'll get to that here in a little while too, but you know, it painted these guys to be these renegade bums, really, and of course they were not. They were anything but. Frankly, they were professionals, consummate professionals, most of them anyway. And we're going to dive into some of these personalities today and dispel some of these myths about these guys and reinforce some of the hard truths about some of these guys too. But you were saying, Bill,
to that point, you know, consider the context of the time at which the TV show was produced. You had yet other World War II related TV shows like The Dirty Dozen that really turned World War II soldiers, sailors, and Marines into hippies. It was the 60s and 70s, the hippie generations, and they wanted these renegades to look modern-ish. And so what they did is they transformed these personalities from the 1940s into what the way they might have behaved in the 1960s, in the Flower Children, Summer of Love kind of time. And that so distorted the historical truth that it made them into caricatures, sadly, rather than, you know, no embellishment was required for these personalities. They had plenty of color as they were, but for some reason, the TV show producers thought they needed to be brought to modern times in the 60s and 70s, which just absolutely ruined it for me anyway.
I agree, you know, and as a young boy watching this, you know, you see all this and it's like, man, these guys are, you know, they're pretty cool, but it did a disservice to them. Well, we're not here to bash the show. We're here to talk about the actual guys, and we're going to get to that in just a second. But for a lot of us, you know, myself, yourself, you know, this is how we were introduced to these particular guys. And over the years, I came to know personally quite a few of them, and the survivors, and they were nothing like they were portrayed on TV. There were a couple that were, you know, kind of out there, but the vast majority of them were professional officers. They were there to do a job, you know. So Greg Boyington's VMF-214, the one that, you know, is easily the most famous 214, was not the first iteration of that squadron. The first VMF-214, just so everybody is aware, was actually commissioned at Eva Field in Hawaii and on Oahu on July 1st, 1942. They were initially named the Swashbucklers, which is, kind of a cool name, not as cool as the Black Sheep, but still, pretty cool. And they saw a little bit of combat in the Solomon Islands, but really didn't do much of anything. They did their 6-week combat tour. This is at the tail end, at the very end of the Guadalcanal campaign. Not to say that Guadalcanal wasn't still hopping in terms of aerial combat, because it was, but these guys just didn't see a whole hell of a lot of action. They didn't make much of a name for themselves. In August of 1943, after a very short combat tour, the Swashbucklers were disbanded, and their unit designation, VMF-214, was assigned to a unit that was currently constituting on Espiritu Santo. And we're going to get to how the Black Sheep came to be here in just a couple minutes. There, on Espiritu Santo, a collection of 27 pilots, some of whom had never seen combat, and some of them who had seen combat previously. And they were thrown together in an ad hoc group to form a brand new fighter squadron to ship out to the Southwest Pacific area and engage in combat. They were put under the command of one Major Gregory Boyington. And this is, Greg Boyington is, again, as I said in the intro, he's up there in the top echelon of maybe top 10 guys that when you think of World War II and you think of fighter pilots, he's one of the top 2 for sure that pops in, at least in my mind. Bill, who was Greg?
These were Marine pilots, of course. He's Major Greg Boyington, not Lieutenant Commander Greg Boyington. But he was born in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho in 1912. Like most would-be aviators in those days, he was exposed to flying at a very early age. He always, I think he was 6 years old when he took his very first flight in like a barnstormer type of airplane. He was an adventurous kid. He seemingly had a knack for getting into trouble, even as a young boy. He was very athletic, very physical, and he was an avid wrestler. In high school, was on the wrestling team, continued through that in Washington University, holding the Pacific Northwest intercollegiate middleweight titles for some time. Now, here's an interesting part. In high school and college, he was not so much of a renegade as we would later come to know. He was academically gifted. He actually got a bachelor's degree in aeronautical engineering. So he wasn't this dude who could kind of barely pass what we call the Naval Academy bull major. And you could know what the bull stands for, BS, which is non-technical, right? He wasn't one of those kinds of guys. He was very technical. He graduated in 1934 from college, joined the Army ROTC program because he decided, kind of his personality was aligned to military things. And upon graduation, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Army and served with the 630th Coast Artillery at Fort Worden, Washington. But he still wanted to fly, Seth. So he applied for flight training in the Army and was rejected because by this point in his life, he was married. He was pretty much a straight shooter. He was not crazy, as his reputation would develop. And, just kind of, he wasn't satisfied, though, with his life in the Army. And so What happened after that, Seth?
Yeah, I mean, you nailed it. And that at this point in his life, and we all know Greg Boyington from the hard drinking renegade that he unfortunately became. But at this point in his life, you nailed it. He was a straight arrow. He was highly intelligent. He was no, fool. I mean, the guy was really smart. And to your point, he got married right out of college, and he did not know this at the time. And this may have changed his way of thinking because he so desperately wanted to fly that, to your point, the Army did not allow married men to be pilots. So an interesting part of his life is that at this time in his life, Greg Boyington, as we know him, was actually known as Greg Hollenbeck. His mother had a common law. Yeah, his mother had a common law husband by the last name of Hollenbeck. And that's who he was. He was Gregory Hollenbeck.
He didn't even know his name was Boyington.
Right.
Until he needed
Right.
a copy of his birth certificate for something in the military. I forget what it was, but he grabs his copy of the birth certificate. He says, "What? My name is not Hollenbeck. My name is
Right.
Boyington." And he has to conform to what his birth certificate says on his application. And so that's when he becomes Greg Boyington rather than Greg Hollenbeck.
Yeah. And it's kind of odd, but you see the wheels turning in the man's head. As soon as he finds out that his real last name is Boyington, he puts two and two together and realizes nobody knows who the hell Greg Boyington is, and nobody knows that Greg Boyington is married.
Boyington's, yeah, guess right. On paper, Greg Boyington's not married; he's single.
That's right. He's a single man.
It's Greg Hollenbeck who's the married guy. This Greg Boyington character, he's single. So let me use that.
Yep. And he does. He applies he enlists in the United States Marine Corps under the name of Greg Boyington, which is his legal name. And he applies for flight cadet training and is granted such because, according to the Corps, he's a single dude. And the Corps had the same rules. He couldn't be a married man and be a pilot at the same time. But under the name of Greg Boyington, he was a single man. And that's exactly what happens here. He gets his wings of gold in 1937. He trains at Pensacola, by the way, just if anybody wants to know. He did his training at Pensacola, and that's where he graduated from and got his wings. He began his aviation career in the interwar years before returning to Pensacola in 1940 as a flight instructor. And this is where his life, and again, up to this point, up until 1940, Greg Boyington is a straight arrow. He's a restless guy. You know, he's a guy that craves action. He's he's developing this lack of respect for authority, but he's not a drinker. He's not even a smoker. He doesn't smoke cigarettes, no cigars, no pipes, nothing. You know, he doesn't even drink beer, nothing. And, you know, he's kind of got this, you know, FU attitude to superior officers. But, you know, other than that, he's pretty straight-laced cat. At this time, he's assigned to Pensacola as a flight instructor. As I said, he's away from his wife and his family. And I say family because at this time he's got 3 kids. He's got 3 children with his wife.
Right.
When he's not training young men to fly, he gets bored. And the story goes that one day, or one afternoon rather, he's invited to go to the officers club with a friend of his, a fellow instructor pilot, and they're sitting at the bar, and Greg is just kind of sitting there, just, you know, probably listening to the radio or reading the paper. And his buddy offers him a drink. And Boyington's like, I'm not really into that kind of thing. He's like, oh, come on, one's not going to hurt you. And I mean, I'm not making this up. This is, you know, in his book, and it's confirmed by his biographer, Bruce Gamble, that, you know, he took one drink, and that literally is all it took. And for some people, unfortunately, that is all it takes.
Yeah, he actually said, I'm sad it took me all these years to discover alcohol. He made a comment like that, right? I should have been doing this much earlier in my life. And I have to make this kind of pseudo snide remark that the Pensacola Officers Club has ruined many a pilot's career. Now, it didn't ruin Pappy Boyington's flying career back then, although if this kind of thing had happened to him today, it would not have gone well for him.
Yeah, it kind of set him on the path to destruction. Really, it really did. Whether that bar did or not, or obviously it was his own personal behavior that did. And you know, it's an unfortunate thing. Alcoholism is a disease, and we're not going to get into that here. But it was very clear that Greg Boyington was afflicted with that very thing.
Yeah, unfortunately, tipped him off, and he was just he immediately became known as kind of a mean drunk. He would get in fights.
Yeah.
You know, he picked the biggest guy at the bar, and he would say, "Okay, that's the guy I'm going to go after tonight." Yeah. And so he was a regular terror at the Pensacola Officers Club.
Yeah, and he would just, for no reason at all, he would just start a fight. And being the kind of a guy that he was, physically, you know, able to handle himself, he had no fear. He had no fear. So, you know, as I said, among his other less than flattering reputation, traits, aside from his drinking, was his lack of respect for authority. And this continues for the rest of his life. This is nothing that he just, shakes off at any point. While staging an impromptu mock dogfight over Quantico, Boyington's, which was without orders, by the way, he was up there just flying around, and he and another pilot decided to mix it up in the air. His airplane ran into trouble. He had engine trouble, and the only place he could put the bird down and not kill people was the firing range at Quantico, which happened to be being used at that time. And there were several high-ranking officers, several colonels in presence when Boyington puts his bird, unauthorized flight, down in the middle of the friggin' firing range. And it just, you can imagine that did not go well.
Ready on the right, ready on the left, already on the firing line. Pop, 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 pop. Oh, what's that airplane doing? Yeah, not something you see every day. Yeah.
No, and then certainly not something that's going to endear you.
Yeah, then in August of 41, he was drunk again, got into a fight with a Navy lieutenant commander over the lieutenant commander's woman, girlfriend, wife, I can't remember which it was. But again, so he's, at this time, I think he's still a second lieutenant. And so he gets in this fight with his lieutenant commander's woman, and you can imagine that doesn't go well either. So at this point, his wife has had enough, right? Because he comes home drunk, and so things are not good. And so his wife decides, that's it, we're done. So she leaves him and takes the 3 children with her back to Washington State. And if he had any governor on his, on him at all, regulating the RPMs, at that point, it was completely removed. When she moved back to Washington State, there was nothing that was going to control him. So this is a bad issue for him. The Marine Corps actually loves his flying ability, hates his behavior, and they're starting to think now, how do we protect this guy from himself?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and something we got to add here is that, again, still the Corps had no clue that he was a married man with 3 children. And he was maintaining 2 residences on a second lieutenant's, or he may by this time been a full lieutenant, pay in 1941 at this point. So this is, he's not making a whole lot of cash, and he's maintaining 2 households with a wife and 3 children. So he's on the razor's edge of, big time. He's got debts up to his eyeballs all over Pensacola, all over the region, because he's borrowing money because he can't afford to keep up 2 households. So once his wife takes the kids and goes back home, it kind of alleviates some of his financial strain, but he's still in debt up to his nose. And he goes, and this is not a good step for him. However, this false step does sort of set him on the right path. A few days later, after he gets into this drunken fight and his wife leaves him, he's broke. He is destitute. I mean, he doesn't have a penny to his name because his wife took every nickel he had and goes back home. He tries to cash a check at a bar that is owned by a friend of his, and that check is a bad check. And he knew full well that that was a bad check. The bar owner, who, again, as I said, was a friend of his, stopped him and said, "Look, I know you're broke. You cannot cash this check here, but I got a thing that might just help you out."
There's some guy upstairs in our bar right now who's recruiting for pilots to go fly in China. How would you like to make fast cash?
Yep. That is exactly it. He knew that after his altercation with the lieutenant commander, and then previous to that, putting a bird down on the firing range at Quantico, probably at this, because we're not at war yet, probably his days with the Corps were limited. And he certainly probably wasn't going to be flying very much longer. They were going to yank him from flight status, which would mean, of course, even less pay. He needed cash, and he needed it now. So to your point, he goes upstairs into this bar, and he goes and sees this cat who is recruiting people for a company called Camco, C-A-M-C-O. What the hell is Camco?
Yeah, it's a Chinese American coordination company, something like that. What they're doing is they're basically, you would all know this company as the organization that's manning the Flying Tigers. So everybody remembers that the Flying Tigers were pilots, American pilots, foreign pilots, flying in China against the Japanese. And the interesting thing about the Flying Tigers is the military, the United States military, allowed military pilots to join the Flying Tigers and fly essentially for the Chinese national government as they're fighting against Japan before we entered the war, before December 7th. And it was funded by an American industrialist named William Pauly. So you could take a leave of absence from your commissioned service in the Marine Corps, Army, Navy, whatever, go to China and fly for these guys. And the compensation scheme was really weird because you actually got paid by the number of Japanese aircraft you shot down. Now, this was really intriguing for this dude named Pappy. He wasn't named Pappy yet, I should say, but because he thinks he's a hot pilot who can, basically light the world on fire once he's given the opportunity. So he's going for this gangbusters.
Absolutely. To that point, he resigns his commission in the Marine Corps on August 26, 1941. And he accepts this position with Camco that you just explained eventually, well, not eventually, is basically the front for the Flying Tigers. He's released from service. He is classified as a metal worker to instruct the Chinese. And he's sent overseas. He's one of the first recruits that are installed into the first American volunteer group, the AVG, which is known, of course, today as the Flying Tigers. While flying with the Tigers, he gets over to China over there. He's flying P-40s. While flying with the Tigers, Boyington's brash personality, shall we say, his lack of respect for authority immediately clashes with the commander of the Flying Tigers, a gentleman by the name of Claire Chennault. Claire Chennault was straight-laced, razor's edge, straight arrow, professional officer. And he and Boyington mixed like oil and water. However, Chennault could not deny the fact that Boyington could fly. Like he could fly. Greg Boyington thought he was a hot pilot. Well, he thought that because he was a damn good pilot. But Boyington's reputation and his behavior did not endear him to Claire Chennault at all. When he wasn't flying, he was getting drunk. He alienated most of his fellow Flying Tigers pretty quickly because when he was drunk, as you said earlier, Bill, he was a jackass. And he was not a well-liked individual within that group. But again, he was a natural in the air, and he did see some combat with the P-40s, with the Flying Tigers, didn't he, Bill?
He did. Yeah, he actually shot down 2 Japanese airplanes in the air. And here's where his behavior was self-defeating. He's doing this Flying Tigers for 2 reasons. Number one, he's still in deep debt, and he's trying to make some money to crawl his way out of debt. I think they were paid something like $500 for every Japanese airplane they shot down, which was a lot of money back then. Exactly. And the second reason, of course, is he was afraid he would be kicked out of the Marine Corps, and this is kind of like time out from the Marine Corps. So he, could kind of hit the pause button in getting demerits and his Marine Corps service. But the problem was, in order to get paid, he had to have credit for the Japanese airplanes. And the guy who gave him credit was Claire Chennault, his boss. Right. And so Claire wasn't going to throw him any favors. So Boyington shoots 2 Japanese airplanes down in air-to-air and then destroys another 2 Japanese airplanes on the ground. And Boyington's trying to take credit for 4 destroyed Japanese airplanes, not the 2. And of course, Chennault's not going to let that happen.
Right.
If you got credit for airplanes that are destroyed on the ground, then heck, artillerymen could get paid for destruction of airplanes on the ground. And the Chennault's position was the only thing that counted were air-to-air kills. And so you only deserve credit for 2, Boyington, not the 4 you claim, which really pissed Boyington off.
Big time. The only reason, well, as you said, there were 2 reasons. One, he was pretty sure he was going to get kicked out of the Corps anyway. And then 2, he needed that cash. He was up to debt, up to here. And he needed that money, and he needed it like yesterday. So the fact that Claire Chenault was like, "No, dude, you only got two. I'm only paying you for two, not four." Actually, yeah, that's a lot of money, man. In 1941, that's a lot of cash. And
Yeah.
he was hot, to say the least. Boyington did not recognize the fact that ground kills don't count, and it enraged him to such a point that he actually broke his own contract with the AVG and financed his way back home to the United States with the $1,000 that he had made. So any money that he made, he blew going home, because by now the United States is at war. We are at war with Japan, and he makes his way via all kinds of ports of across the Pacific and gets his way back home to the United States. And again, just as broke as when he left.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. But he gets back in April of 42, paying his own way. And he goes back to the Marine Corps and says, "Hey, look, I'm one of your very, very few combat experienced pilots now. You ought to let me back in. I'm willing to set aside my, sabbatical from the Marine Corps and come back. But I think I deserve a major's commission. You're doing field promotions for all these people out there in the Solomons with far less experience than I have. You need to give me a major's commission and I'll come back." And it works. He talks his way back in. Now he's a major, and he's qualified to be squadron commander at that rank.
If nothing else, the guy had the gift of gab. I mean, he talked his way into that major, because he wasn't anywhere. He wasn't even a captain when he left the Corps. Yeah. And if he was, I'm sure somebody will say, correct me, but I'm about 99.9% certain he was not even a captain. So he basically jumped a rank and a half maybe, and got his way into a major's commission. Now, to his point, he was a combat experienced pilot, and in that time during the war, there weren't very many in the United States Marine Corps that could claim that status. What he did when he went in there is he took the two aerial kills that he had. He also claimed the two ground kills, ground destructions that he had, and then he added an additional two. So when he goes into the Corps, he says, "Oh, hey, by the way, I'm an ace with the AVG. I shot down 6 planes," knowing full well he had not. He knew damn well he had not shot down 6 aircraft. And yet the Corps in those days, you got to remember this ain't like today where they can shoot a text to Claire Chenault and say, "Hey, Claire, did Greg shoot down 6 aircraft?" They took him at his word, because they knew that he was over there in China with the AVG. So
they would have all of a sudden has 6 kills. Telegram, and because there was no radio contact, this is not a military unit in China. So it would have taken 6 months to validate. They didn't have 6 months. The war was going hot and heavy at Guadalcanal. They needed pilots in Guadalcanal right away, flying F-4F Wildcats. And he seemed to be a great pilot. So let's send him out there and take him at his word until we could prove it's not true.
Right, exactly. And that's exactly what they do. He gets out in January 1943. He's deployed to the South Pacific. And by May of 43, he's flying F-4F Wildcats, as you said, as executive officer of VMF-122. Within weeks, Boyington takes command of 122 after his CO was promoted out of the area. So he goes from not even in the Corps to talking his way into a major's rank or major's commission. And then just a few months later, he's in the Pacific. He's now CO of a fighting squadron based off of Guadalcanal. So, I mean, it's a rather sharp turn of events in Greg Boyington's life to get him to this stage. Now, again, he has the chance to keep that straight edge going, and he doesn't do that. He gets into 122. It's relatively a short time that he's there, because he decides to get loaded one night and start wrestling with a couple of the pilots, and he lands awkwardly and breaks his friggin' ankle. And at this point, he has to go to, I'm not sure if he goes to a hospital ship or a hospital. Yeah. Either way, he's out of it for a while his leg heals.
Yeah.
In the 6 weeks he's with 120. Go ahead.
No, what I was going to say is, he's now grounded with a broken ankle, and his squadron racks up 35.5 kills while he's recuperating from his ankle surgery. I think you were going to say he was gone for about 6 weeks. Is that right, Seth?
Yeah, something like that. Something like that. Yeah. Yeah.
How
you know, that had to
it has to be for him.
I was going to say that thing, same thing.
Yeah.
You know, that had to piss him off because he didn't see any Japanese planes when he was at 122.
Yeah.
However, fate had another road for Greg Boyington here at this point. This is the birth of the Black Sheep. This is how they came about. Admiral William Halsey, who we've talked about for a long time now, and we will continue to do so, was fully aware that his area of operations needed fighter squadrons. They needed fighter squadrons. They needed fighter aircraft in there to combat. Because remember, you got to remember, at this point in the war, we're working our way up the Solomons. We're trying to get to and isolate Rabaul and eliminate that base in the Solomons and take hold of that entire area. The Japanese base at Rabaul and the surrounding areas are full of Japanese fighters, and he needs more fighters than he needs attack aircraft at this time, and he's aware of this. So with a dearth of stateside formed squadrons, but a plethora of desk-bound pilots in the Pacific, Halsey had the men he needed to form several new squadrons to continue to push the Japanese up the Solomons chain towards Rabaul. Orders were given to those 27 random pilots that I was talking about in the Marine Corps, who, for all intents and purposes, were homeless. Like, these are guys that had just finished their tour. Yeah, exactly. Or just sitting around the barracks, you know, playing cards. These were guys that had either just finished their tour and hadn't gone home yet, or guys who had their unit was rotated out and they hadn't flown enough time to go home yet, which was the case for a lot of them. And they're just kind of sitting around with nothing to do, and they're piled into this squadron that is formed under the name of VMF-214. Boyington's given command of this squadron, and and just to get a little bit back into the weeds here just a minute, in this time period before he takes command of 214, Boyington was actually given command of several squadrons, but virtually in name only. He didn't do any flying with these people. He basically was just doing paperwork, which he hated. He absolutely loathed it, and we'll see here in a minute that hatred of paperwork continues. Yeah. And so he's CO in name only. He's not really doing anything. When he gets 214, he's aware, his age. At this point, he's 30 years old. His rank, which is a major, which is, as you said, is field grade. He knows he's probably doesn't have a whole lot of time left to get into combat. So he knows that this is probably his last shot at any kind of combat fame or service. And he wants to make the best of what he's given here. But unfortunately, his reputation as a drinker and his disrespect for authority precedes him. His new pilots had heard of him before. Several of them had served with him in 122. However, all of them, despite his reputation for being a drinker, a renegade, a lack of respect for authority, kind of a jackass, they all immediately loved him. He was outspoken, he was unorthodox, and that just resonated with this group of guys. One black sheep in particular, a guy named Bruce Matheson, who was one of the more famous black sheep to emerge from the squadron, said of Boyington, quote, "It soon became apparent to us too that he was not popular with the other senior officers, and this tended to make us gel around him more because he would turn to us more often than his peers," unquote. So because Boyington didn't have any friends, Yeah.
No, if I could summarize his philosophy at this point, it was, he would tell his men that, look, I'm not here to make my bosses happy. I'm not here to make friends among my peers. I'm here to kill Japanese. If you're with me, we're gonna do our job. If you're not with me, find another squadron to work. It's kind of another Mush Morton-like speech. Now, Mush was protected from alcoholism by the fact he spent months at sea on a submarine without alcohol. But I can see a kinship between Pappy Boyington and Mush Morton that would have been really made them good friends had they been closer together. Yeah.
kind of cut from the same kind of cloth, really, to a point. I
Right.
mean, obviously,
Yeah.
there's, as you said, there's obvious differences, but their ideals of leadership and their ideals of getting on with the war were very similar, very similar.
Mhm.
So while 214 was a new squadron, I use air quotes there because, as I said, there was an iteration of it before, but this version was a new squadron. It was actually stacked with a lot of experienced guys, a lot of guys who'd seen a lot of combat previous. Some, as I said, that had flown with Boeington in 122. One in particular was a friend of mine by the name of Hank Bourgeois. They called him Dr. Boo. Bourgeois was from New Orleans. He actually went to my high school alma mater, which I thought was really cool. And Hank was not initially selected for 214. He wasn't among the initial 27 pilots that were selected for 214. He was actually recruited by Boeington. Bourgeois was one of those guys who didn't have enough combat time to go home. He was just kind of sitting there, but he was not one of the initial pool that was selected. I remember Hank told me he basically, Bourgeois was sitting in the O Club there at Espirito Santo, and Boeington walks in and he walks over to Bourgeois and he says, "Hey, Boo, I'm forming a new squadron. You want to go with me?" And Bourgeois was like, "Yeah, sure, let's do it." And that was it. That's how he got into VMF-214.
Why do they call Boo Dr. Boo?
It's a long story, but it's a great story. And I'm going to cut it very, very short. At one point in his career, he's flying F-4U Corsairs, and his aircraft, it develops engine trouble, and he has to put the bird down in the water. His squadron mates see him do this. They know he puts it down in a lagoon. They see him climb out of the airplane. They see him paddle his way over to the shore, and they see the natives like come to him and take him away. They know this is a friendly island. They know he's in good shape. They know he's in good hands. And they said, "Oh, we're going to come get you in a couple of days." And they eventually do, obviously. In the meantime, Bourgeois is brought to the native village, and the chief's daughter, when they get into the village, he's a white man with theoretically has medical supplies, and he goes in there, and the chief says, they bring him into this hut where the chief's daughter is laying there, very obviously pregnant, about to give birth. She's in incredible pain, labor pains, and they basically say, "Can you do anything for her?" And he's like, "The hell can I do?" So he reaches into his med kit and he pulls out 2 aspirin, and he tells her, says, "Take 2 of these." So she does. Whatever.
Which is probably not a good idea because it'll aid bleeding. So
Yeah, blood thinners, exactly. Such as it is. The woman does give birth to the baby. She survives. The baby survives. The PBY comes to pick up Bourgeois like a couple days later. Mm-hmm. And as he's getting ready to leave, the daughter and the chief come out, and they say, "This is my grandson, this is my son," whatever. And they present the baby to Hank as he's getting ready to climb on the PBY. And the chief says to him, "We named him Bourgeois after Bourgeois." So there's a man somewhere in the Solomon Islands that was named Bourgeois after Hank Bourgeois. And when he gets back to his squadron, he tells this story, which is apparently true. And he gets the nickname instantly of Dr. Boo. Yeah. True story.
All right. True story. Well, he fit right into Boyington's squadron here. And then as they're searching names for the squadron, right? They had originally been called some other name, call sign, or squadron name. What was it? I can't
exactly. Remember. They're sitting around and they're trying to figure out the name that they want to call themselves, and they're because they feel that being kind of outcasts, they were all thrown together. None of them had a home until now. They kind of considered themselves to be bastards, so they decided to call themselves Boeington's Bastards. And I forget who came up with that name, and I don't even think nobody knows who came up with that name, but they went to Boeington and they said, "Hey, look at our new name." And Boeington apparently was very flattered by the selection of the name, but even Greg Boeington was like, "That ain't gonna work, guys. You'll need to come up with a different name, because this just ain't gonna fly."
So they don't like Boeington's Bastards. Okay.
Oh, they loved it, but Boeington didn't like it.
Okay, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So they get back together, and I'm talking about like the pilots as a group are sitting there in a hut somewhere, and they're trying to figure out a name after Boeington's Bastards is shot down. And they get into, and again, I'm not sure who actually proposed the name Black Sheep, but it was proposed that the insignia, it was instantly accepted when they say, hey, why don't we call ourselves the Black Sheep? And they had this. Exactly. Yeah. We're kind of orphaned. We're kind of ostracized. We were picked up from all corners of the Corps, and here we are. So, once that's proposed, they're like, yeah, that's a really good name. And they designed their own squadron insignia. It's a white shield with a black bar diagonally across the shield, and a forlorn looking little black sheep in one corner symbolized their thrown together status, and also Boeington's black sheep reputation amongst senior officers in the Navy and the Marine Corps. Atop their new insignia, they stylized their bird, the airplane that they were going to fly, the famous gull-winged F-4U Corsair. This was a hot new bird in the Pacific Theater. And I want to talk about the Corsair here briefly, Bill, because it is easily, next to maybe the P-51, the most iconic fighter aircraft in the United States arsenal of World War II, not just because it looks cool, and it does, but because it was a bad plane. I mean, it was a mean machine. It was
also very hard to fly.
Let's talk about it.
Yes. Yeah, no. It was designed by Bureau of Aeronautics, I think around 1938, before the war began. Its first flight was in 1940. The Navy accepted the aircraft design and requested VOT to build 581 of the new fighters, with delivery to begin in June of 1942. Now, it was an absolute beast. It mounted the largest engine available at that time, 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wrap radial engine. The power plant could deliver an astonishing 2,000 horsepower and would drive the bird to speeds in excess of 400 miles an hour. Now, for those that, I was a civilian pilot decades ago, but for those who don't understand, these reciprocating engines with prop, they produce an enormous amount of torque. And in order to overcome that torque, you have to give opposite rudder, really excess opposite rudder, particularly if you jam the throttle really rapidly. If you don't offset that torque with opposite rudder very quickly, you lose control of the airplane. Now, you might have seen the recent movie titled Devotion, about a Korean War Thomas Hudner Medal of Honor recipient, who I had the honor to escort to the Korean War Memorial dedication ceremony in 1996. And so the pilots deal with that airplane in the movie and to demonstrate how difficult it was to fly and overcome that torque. So it's an incredibly powerful engine, an incredibly powerful airplane with its very iconic gull wing design, which was designed to easier fold the wings for carrier flight operations. This huge 13-foot, 3-bladed propeller, which also required a modification of the wing design. And so, it was very powerful, but very difficult to fly. And so, only the best pilots could really do well in it. And it also had a really odd name given to it by the Japanese, Seth. I'm trying to remember what that name was.
It's one of the coolest nicknames I've ever heard. The Japanese eventually called the Corsair Whistling Death. And if you've ever seen a Corsair, which we all have, the air intakes on the wing, on the leading edge of the wings are right there at the wing roots. And when these things dive, and I've heard them dive, live, when you hear them dive, they do make a shrieking whistling sound, not like Stuka-like or anything like that. But they have a very distinct sound when they dive, and when they dive, they do whistle. And the Japanese called them Whistling Death, which is just bad to the bone. It was initially designed as a fighter aircraft, designed to be put aboard flat tops. It was supposed to be a carrier aircraft, which obviously later in the war it does become that. But initially, it was plagued with, to your point, it was hard to drive. But it was also plagued with technical issues too. It's massive nose that housed the huge engine, and it had a significant slant to the fuselage when on the ground. Combined with the massive propeller, it caused it had huge, severe visual issues that initially, in order to see, the Corsairs would taxi down they'd S-turn all the way down the runway. Can't do that on a carrier, man.
No.
Can't do that. So, another thing that and this is interesting too, it tended to have hydraulic leaks in the nose when at low speeds, particularly when it would come into land. Hydraulic fluid would shoot out of the canopy all over the windscreen and temporarily blind the pilots as they're coming in the land. This is why you see a lot of pictures of and footage of these F4Us with these white lines on the top of the canopies. People think that's paint, that was there for like some sort of identification. It's surgical tape. It was surgical tape put there to keep the hydraulic oil in the damn engine in the nacelle, as opposed to coming out all over the windscreen. So it's not paint. When you're building model kits as a kid, you're like, oh, cool, these are cool, white stripes. No, it's surgical tape, man. It's there for a reason. Because of these deficiencies and others, which would all be solved in due time. They would clearly be solved in due time. The Navy rejected the Corsair, despite all the money and the research time put into it. They rejected the Corsair for carrier duty and immediately gave it to the Marine Corps to fly off of land. The British flew a lot of the Corsairs too. They flew a ton of them, frankly. Several nations did, but at this point, we're talking about the Corps flying these birds. Due to its radical tendencies, of which we just laid out just a handful, frankly, the Corsair initially earned the derogatory nicknames by the Americans who flew them, called it the hose nose, the hog, the ensign eliminator, and the bent wing bastard. So it wasn't necessarily loved initially by the men who flew it. Yet, in the hands of the right type of guy, in which, of course, Greg Boyington is that type of guy, and his black sheep are those type of people, this thing was mean. By the end of the war, Bill, it had, let me preface this. It first saw combat on Valentine's Day in 1943. It would soon prove itself to be a zero killer. By the end of the war, it held one of the highest kill ratios against against fighters, period. What was it, Bill? It was like they claimed
2,140 victories to only 189 losses, which is an 11-to-1 kill ratio, which is incredible. Now, remember, think about earlier in the war when we, the kill ratio was not quite reverse of that. And then the Japanese had their best pilots early in the war, and the Zeros were fighting F4Fs, right? Which was not a terrific airplane in any category. And now, middle of the war, which is like mid-1943, and we're getting these airplanes in, and it's the ratio has turned right around now. I'm sure that the loss of very capable, competent Japanese pilots had something to do with that, because of their horrible, record in recovering down pilots. It had something to do with the reversal, but the airplane itself was a substantial contributor to that kill ratio as well.
Absolutely. And it is one of the most iconic, as we said earlier, it's one of the most iconic aircraft of World War II. It's probably one of the most iconic aircraft ever, frankly. And, as a kid growing up, I had visions in my head of driving Corsairs. I think we all did, at some point in our lives. It is a bad bird. So VMF-214 had a very short training period. They only had about 3 weeks of training as a unit before they were deployed to the combat area. They're sent out of Espirito Santo to the front lines, which for them at this point is the Russell Islands. They had, at this time, even during their 3-week training period, they had a serious problem getting the bare necessities. And this, of course, adds to their, ire, that they are the black sheep. They had a serious problem getting the bare necessities to maintain the aircraft, to, just train the squadron. There were several scroungers in the unit, including future ace Mo Mullins, who proved to be an excellent scrounger, finding equipment, parts, mechanics, and whatever else the squadron needed when the Corps or the Navy did not provide, which was unfortunately more often than not. the Corps
Mhm.
or the Navy were like, go find your own stuff. And the Black Sheep had to do that very thing.
Yeah, the Navy word for trading things to get parts, outside of the normal acquisition process is cumshaw. So you would get a 10-pound can of coffee and say, I'm going to give you this if you give me that wrench or that, or that manifold or whatever. That word is cumshaw. But these guys weren't doing cumshaw so much as they were just stealing. So stealing the parts they needed to keep things working. And
Yeah.
who could blame them, right? Nobody was ever prosecuted for this. When you're, in combat, you do what you need to do to win.
Exactly. And that's exactly what they did, because they knew they were leaving eventually. And then when they get to notice, hey, look, we're shipping out, it was lit. I want to say it was like 48 hours, maybe. It's like, oh yeah, we're leaving, day after tomorrow. So get your crap, let's move. And they did that very thing. They literally scattered to the four winds, tried to find everything they could get their hands on, and loaded it up into airplanes to the move to the Russell Islands.
I'm
It's
reminded
also
of
during
Marines on Guadalcanal stealing M1 Garand rifles too from the Army when they were still firing those 1917 Springfields bolt action rifles. So again, the ground troops weren't above stealing either.
No, hell no. It's also during this training period that Greg Boyington earns a couple of nicknames. Initially, the Black Sheep, because as I said, he's 30 years old. Most of his pilots are 20, 21 years old. So he is an old man to these guys. They start calling him Gramps. And that was his initial nickname. And then they changed it to, it kind of morphed to Grandpappy. And then obviously Pappy came from Grandpappy, and they shortened Grandpappy to Pappy. And that is what he generally went by within the squadron, was Gramps. And several correspondents later on during the Black Sheep, as they gained fame, heard him called Grandpappy. They actually shortened it to Pappy, and his name Pappy Boyington came from the press, not himself. But regardless of this, an average age of 10 years older than any of his men, he absolutely loved the name. He did not take it as a slight. He didn't think that the guys were, using it in a derogatory manner. He absolutely loved the fact that they called him Pappy.
The word ageism didn't exist in 1943, so he saw no downside to being called Grandpappy.
Not at all. Not at all. He just wanted to fly. And to that end, in September, the Black Sheep leave Espiritu Santo and head for their new base, as I said, in the Russell Islands. And on September 16th, 1943, they see their first combat. This is one of their first combat missions is actually, and something we need to remember is when you think of VMF-214 and the Black Sheep, you think of their legacy of being the whole war, and it isn't. They actually only flew as the Black Sheep VMF-214 that we know, or that we think of, for only 2 tours. So their combat tour was not long. So they didn't see a whole heck of a lot of aerial combat, but when they did, they really racked them up because they were filled with talented people. So on September 16th, 1943, 214 is assigned to be an escort contingent of a very large raid that is consisting of U.S. Navy dive bombers and torpedo planes. The F-4U Corsairs of the Black Sheep are up top cover. They're also covered with Royal New Zealand Air Force P-40s and the new Navy F-6F Hellcat fighters. The Black Sheep are up at 20,000 feet. So they're way up that. They are literally top cover. They're way up top. The raid was targeting Balali, however you want to pronounce it, island. This is, of course, if you remember Admiral Yamamoto's shoot down, this is in the same area. It's expected to bring serious Japanese fighter opposition. Boyington at this point is beginning to worry because, as I said, his age, his rank is starting to catch up with him. His unit had seen a little bit of combat. They had not seen any aerial combat. They hadn't scored any aerial kills. And he was starting to worry that he and his squadron were going to be pulled out of the line and replaced with another group if they didn't start racking up some kind of victories here. As they're flying in, Boyington is, for whatever reason, he's not paying attention to what's going on around him. Not paying attention to the situation, all of a sudden he notices that the airplanes that he's supposed to be escorting that being the SPD Dauntless dive bombers, are gone. Like they're gone.
What do dive bombers do? They dive. And so he assumes that, okay, they're descended, they're initiating their attack. So he says, well, we're going to dive too. We're going to find them down there. There's thick clouds. He's below them. So he figures they must be on the other side of the cloud layer. So he takes his squadron and they descend through that cloud layer as well. As he and his sheep penetrate the clouds right there, just as he predicted, where the missing dive bombers and TBFs making their attacks on Bilali. I don't know if that's I don't know which way it's supposed to be pronounced either, Seth, but that's the way
Sounds
I choose to pronounce
it. It sounds good. But when he pops through those clouds and he finds his Dauntless that he's supposed to be, Dauntlesses, that he's supposed to be shepherding out there, he also finds about 40 Japanese fighters.
Yeah. So, who are aware of the Dauntless's presence as well.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. So as he's diving through there, pops out of the clouds, there's the SBDs and the TBS, and they're being attacked by about 40 estimated Japanese fighter aircraft. So the expected Japanese fighter response to this raid is indeed what was expected. It's very heavy. As Boyington's blasting through the formation, he pulls up. He was further shocked to see, aside from the 40 Japanese airplanes, that no more than 25 feet off of his right wing is a Japanese fighter. This Japanese fighter looks over at Boyington face to face, eye to eye, looks at him and waggles his wings. The Japanese clearly had no clue that this is a blue Navy or Marine Corps F4U Corsair on his left wing, waggles his wings, which is go ahead.
I can't understand how he can't tell that this isn't a Japanese airplane.
I don't know.
You take the Zero to the Corsair, they don't look anything alike. But this guy, for whatever, sometimes when you're under a great deal of stress, and combat will produce a great deal of stress, you make decisions that just don't make sense in the light of day. And this is one of those times where you imagine being Pappy in this situation. He looks to the right. This Japanese guy doesn't know that I'm American. This is like some Tom Cruise Top Gun stuff happening right here. You expect Pappy to go inverted on top of him and flip him the bird or something like that. But he doesn't do that. He does what he should do. And he turns his gun sight and charges and just kind of shoots the dude down. Throttle back, the guy accelerate in front of you and just, shoot the dude down. But he's not in the clear here, though, is he, Seth?
No, he is not. And like you said, he pulls behind the guy and shoots the guy down. As he's doing this, he sees tracers just whip past his canopy, and he turns around and he looks, and his wingman, who was Don Fisher, they called him Mo, who was tacked on to Boyington's wing. He notices the tracers zipping past his canopy. He looks behind him and he sees Mo Fisher shooting a Japanese Zero off of Boyington's tail. So Boyington was, at this point, this is not his first taste of combat. Yeah, but he's also kind of situationally unaware here. But that situational unawareness, like I don't know if those tracers whizzing past his canopy woke him up, but after that, he is on. He is on target. In the fur ball over Bilali, whatever, Fisher loses Boyington, because at this point, Boyington's like, I'm out, I'm gone. Poof, and he goes out there and he starts hunting. As the squadron is trying to reform and go back home after the aerial dogfight kind of dies down, they can't find Boyington. What Fisher and the other Black Sheep did not know is that Boyington had become like wildly separated from his group in the aerial dogfight. I mean, you're talking at this point probably 60 to 70 aircraft just mingling up like a swarm of bees. So I mean, there's there's very little communication, and there's no coordination, no organization at all. And it's kind of, at this point, it's every man for himself. Boyington winds up on his own,
which is not a testament to his in the air leadership. It's not a good thing that this is happening. Not
yet, anyway. Not yet. So what Fisher and the rest of the group, as they head home, didn't know is that Boyington had, as I said, he'd become separated from the group, and he was actually riding behind a group of SBDs, because that's the only friendly aircraft that he could find in his parcel of the sky was a friendly group of SPDs, and he's riding back there, and his job is, basically, I'm going to shoo off anything that comes to attack these guys, and I'm going to follow them home, and we'll end the day. Well, as he's flying escort, he encounters enemy fighters and shoots down no less than 4 on his way home, adding the one earlier. That makes him an ace in a day. And the first attack on the way home, ace in a day. And this is confirmed by the Marine Corps. This isn't some of Boyington's, malarkey.
Outrageous
this
claims.
is, this is confirmed by the Corps. The first attack on the way home occurs when Boyington initially noticed the flock of SPDs that I was talking about heading back. They're actually under attack. He pours on the speed. He almost blows past the Zero that he's trying to kill. Instead, he pours fire into him as he blasted through him, causing the aircraft to explode with pieces of the airplane hitting Boyington's Corsair. And he says this is what happens. And when he gets home, there's dents all over the wing roots, all over the leading edges of the wing, all over the cowling, where clearly something hit his airplane in multiple spots. He claims it to be a Zero, and in fact, it apparently is. 2 head-on attacks by Boyington claim 2 further kills. And the 4th on his return flight was shot from the tail of another wounded Corsair. So low on fuel, he lands at Monday. If you recall, Bill, we just talked about the campaign at New Georgia. Yeah.
Bloody fight to take Munda, and now it's paying off.
Yeah. For Greg Boyington specifically, he lands on Munda, refuels, rearms, and heads back to the Russell Islands. Before he ever gets there, the Black Sheep think he's dead. They think he's gone. He doesn't come home. When he gets back home, he puts his Corsair down on the tarmac there, and he receives a raucous welcome from his men who thought he was gone. In his first taste of combat with the Black Sheep, or in the Black Sheep's first taste of combat, they score 11 kills with 8 probables. Boyington's 5 for that day were confirmed, and he became the squadron's first ace. So it didn't take him and his sheep long to get into the fray and really start to make a difference, did it? So
yeah, he already claimed to be an ace, but now he's undoubtedly, without dispute, an ace, not just on paper, but in reality. And it's the first day of combat for the squadron. First day of aerial combat for the group. So they start stacking the kills here pretty quick. And it becomes readily apparent that, or as a couple of our viewers like to count how many times I say it, abundantly clear that whatever, man, that Greg Boyington is not one for paperwork. He's a squadron CO. And as the CO, he's supposed to do things that COs do, not just lead them in combat, but also lead them on the ground and take care of things on the ground. And he fails miserably at that. Make sure they're fully ready for combat, both in the personnel, logistics, maintenance side. All those department heads work for him. And so he's supposed to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. But he was not capable of this, and he realized his weaknesses. And really, like I say in my book, if you aren't capable of doing something, make sure you have people around you who can fill in your own personal gaps. And he does. He hires this guy named Frank Walton in the squadron. And so Frank's got an interesting background, doesn't he, Seth?
He does. So Frank Walton is not a pilot. He's not an aviator. He's an intelligence officer, and he's kind of homeless at this point. He's sent to VMF-214 because of Greg Boyington's lack of paperwork, lack of red tape adherence, the whole thing. Just as you said, he's not doing the things on the ground that he's supposed to do, but nobody's questioning his leadership in the air. But on the ground, he's a screw up, but in the air, he's the man. So they send Frank Walton out there. He's a former LAPD detective. He's brought into 214 strictly to do intelligence, paperwork, and be the press agent. We'll talk about the press agent in a minute. He's also brought in to basically control Greg Boyington, because on the ground, Boyington still would get a hold of alcohol and want to fight his own damn squadron mates and would physically manhandle these people. Frank Walton was a big old boy, And he was one of the few people in the squadron. There's another one, we'll talk about him in a minute, that Boyington looked at and was like, I ain't touching that guy. Just Frank Walton to kill me. So in reality, though, even though Greg Boyington was the skipper of 214, Frank Walton ran VMF-214, at least on the ground. He conducted the briefings. He made sure the airplanes had the required parts that they needed, the maintenance that they needed. He made sure that the ammunition, the fuel, everything was there, the food. I mean, literally everything. He did everything. He was the mother hen of VMF-214, and he took care of literally everything initially, and all the way through really until about the 60s or 70s. He and Boyington were like this. They were best pals. We can talk about this later when they come out with the show that actually kind of seriously hinders his and Walton's relationship. We'll talk about that at the end. But Walton, as I said, he did his very best to keep Pappy sober and keep him away from the booze. But as some of his pilots said, Bruce Matheson specifically said, he was an alcohol magnet. Wherever there was booze, Boyington would find it. Even if there wasn't booze to be found, Boyington would magically appear with bottles of whiskey or whatever he could lay his hands on. And it was just, you know, it's sad because the man had so much talent, and it's just, it's one of those things that, God bless him.
Now, I agree that, you know, Walton was the intelligence officer for the squadron. So it's normal for the intelligence officer to brief the target package for the day. That's not unusual. What is unusual, of course, there was an operations officer as well in the squadron that worked for Boyington. And so the operations officer would brief pilot assignments, things like that. The kinds of things normally the squadron, well, it varies from squadron to squadron, but often the squadron commander would do himself, or the XO would do themselves. And so, but again, it was Walton coordinating, you know, how the briefings went, and basically taking care of everything on the ground. Maintenance officer briefing the status, you know, full mission capable rate of each of the different aircrafts, although I don't think they called it that back then, FMC rate. But in effect, despite the fact he was an intel officer, not a pilot, Walton ran the squadron day-to-day operations.
Yeah, he was an integral part of the group, or of the squadron, and he famously went to write a book after the war about the Black Sheep Squadron, and it's, if you haven't read it, I highly suggest that you do, because it is very, very good, and it's very accurate, unlike Pappy's Baba Black Sheep. But again, we'll get to that in a little while. October 1943 was a busy month for the Black Sheep. Fighter sweeps, which were actually something in the Pacific, and at least in this region, that was, you know, Boyington was like, this is something we need to do. You know, we need to go out there and kill the Japanese fighters, and we need to gain air superiority. This is how we should do it. He proposed the fighter sweep thing. He's not the only one, but he's one of the main proponents of this, and it is accepted because, again, as I said, you know, despite all his flaws, he is a human being. He was a very good, he was an excellent pilot, and to that end, he knew tactics. He knew what should be done and what should not be done, how to do them and how not to do them. And, you know, when he had his moments of clarity, which were more often than not, he proved himself to be a fantastic officer. It's when he didn't have anything to do is when he got himself in trouble. A lot of these fighter sweeps are over Bougainville and Kahili, the Kahili Airdrome, which is a huge Japanese base in the area. What frustrated Boyington and his sheep even more than the rigors and sometimes monotony of flight was the lack of Japanese encounters. And at this point in the war, the Japanese are picking and choosing when they want to engage the Americans. It's not because they're afraid of them or anything like that. It's they're shepherding their forces. They're keeping their forces intact for, and we always talk about it, the almighty, the contact yes, and the almighty decisive fight. And usually, a la September 16th, 43, when they do send a lot of aircraft in the fight, they want to mix it up for a reason. So
they're learning and they're adapting their tactics. And by this point in the war, they also know Boyington by name. Isn't that incredible? I mean, they knew, I imagine they knew some of the submarines by name.
Sure.
But I don't think they knew a whole lot of individual pilots by name and reputation. But again, remember, he's getting a lot of press coverage in the United States, and the Japanese aren't stupid. They read these reports, they read this press. So we're feeding the Japanese intelligence with these press reports as well.
Yeah. And if you remember in the intro, I said that he was respected by friends and foe alike. And it's true.
Mhm.
The Japanese did indeed know who Greg Boyington was. They did know when he was over their airfields, because they would get on the friggin' radio and dare him to come down and fly through the anti-aircraft fire. To which Boyington would get on the radio and respond, and I quote, "Come up and fight, you sons of bitches." So it was like a
Mhm.
back and forth between, two angry neighbors who didn't like one another. Come over
Yeah.
to my airfield and fight. Well, come up here and fight me. And it was just a
Yeah.
constant thing. Well, this one particular day, the Japanese decided to respond to the verbal assault. They did indeed tangle with the Black Sheep. Over 20 enemy aircraft were shot down on October 17th, 1943, without a single loss to VMF-214. So to Greg Boington's point, he wanted the Japanese to come up and fight him, because he knew that if the Japanese did go up there, that his sheep and their Corsairs were going to kick that ass all day long. And that's what they were doing. They were making a name for themselves, and they were wiping the Japanese out. Not every time, but they were inflicting some serious casualties on the Japanese.
Yeah. Over the next few weeks, Boynton shot down Japanese planes in bunches, 2 at a time, 3 at a time, 4 at a time. In a period of 32 days, he shot down 14 Japanese aircraft of varying types, mostly fighters. And the American press became aware of this. And so, like I said, they're putting these stories together about the heroic Pappy Boyington and the Black Sheep Squadron, cobbling together a story mostly true, but some fictionalized, about this motley crew of orphan pilots. There's truth in all of that, right? Who were led by a former Flying Tiger, and it was just too much. And so, the press just ate it up, and editors were asking for more of these exploits of the Black Sheep Squadron. And they did 57 kills in 6 weeks. And all of that was covered very vigorously by the press.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And at this point now, Boyington is approaching Eddie Rickenbacker's record of 26 kills. Now, we had a previous episode on the Cactus Air Force where we talked about Joe Foss, who tied Rickenbacker's record of 26 kills. Boyington is steadily climbing the ranks of, he's getting there.
He's on glide slope.
Yeah, and he was, you would think, now later in life, he did like the limelight. He did like the press, because that's how he made his money. But during the war, you would think Boyington was this flashy guy during the war, and that he was like, all Mr. Press. And no, not at all. Quite the opposite, actually.
He wasn't doing what Halsey was doing, where Halsey was crafting these very clever statements that he knew with certainty would get him on the front page of newspapers. Boyington was pushing these guys back, was saying, "Hey, Frank Walton, you handle this. I don't want to deal with these dudes."
Right. Yeah. I mean, it was getting to the point now, whereas he's steadily climbing the ranks of the aces, and he's getting closer to Rickenbacker's record, that he was besieged by reporters before he'd even get out of his airplane. He'd shut the bird down, crank open the canopy, get ready to get out, and there's somebody to stick a microphone in his face, and he's like, "Get the hell away from me. I've got things I've got to do." Because again, when it came to the combat, he was the man. He was the man. And he was more concerned. Yeah, he was more concerned about his people than about, he was aware that he was climbing the ranks. I'm not going to sit there and sugarcoat it and say he wasn't aware. No, he's completely aware. But he to your point, Bill, he would shun people off to Frank Walton, and Frank Walton became VMF-214's press agent. He was the guy that was saying, "Okay, this guy shot down this guy shot down that guy," and all this kind of stuff. When pressed to give an interview, eventually he would relent. He's like, fine. He would say, and I quote, he says, "I didn't come out here to make news, damn it all. I came out here to fight a war." So, I mean, that'll tell you right then and there, he was not seeking the limelight. He was seeking to make a difference, and which is what his VMF-214 was indeed doing. So that kind of dispels a little bit of the popular myth about Boyington, that he was this flashy, headline grabbing ace. He was not. I mean, the press is what made him, but he didn't care about that. He wasn't the only colorful character. We talked about Dr. Boo, who was, given that nickname, but not by his own choosing. But there were several people within the Black Sheep that were colorful characters. And there's this one guy in particular I want to talk about. He had a nickname. He was called Wild Man McGee. This guy, his name was Chris McGee. He's a perfect example of what the TV show kind of alluded to, that all these guys were these renegade, cowboys in the air. McGee actually kind of was that to an extent. He was one of the original Black Sheep. So he was one of the 27 that's put into the group, or into the, I keep saying group, I'm sorry. He's one of the 27 that's put into the squadron initially. He was a 9-kill ace. He was a Navy Cross recipient, but he had the reputation of as a bit of an eccentric. He was from Chicago. He originally flew with the RCAF. He flew with the Royal Canadian Air Force, and he eventually returned to the United States and joined the Corps. He was a fitness fanatic. When not flying, he would often be found standing there in a pair of blue workout shorts with barbells, just doing curls that he brought with him all the way across the Pacific. As I said, Frank Walton was one guy that Boyington would never tangle with. Chris McGee was the other one. Because Chris McGee, Boyington knew, like, McGee will whoop me every day, because he was literally looked like he was chiseled from stone. He was just this big boy, just a big dude.
He was also a drinker, right? He was one of the few guys
he
who
was.
could match Pappy drink for drink, which was not something that Pappy actually needed.
Right.
But when the team, he was a team player when it came for it, but he was also a loner who craved excitement and adventure. And, one of his squadron mates, Fred Rope Losh, I love that call sign Rope, said of him, Chris was the original hippie. He said this obviously in the 70s. Chris was the original hippie, no drugs or anything like that. He was just a different kind of guy, a great guy. If you needed him, he was there, but he wanted to do something. But if he wanted to do something, he did it. And he never worried about the consequences. For example, Seth, how did he get that nickname Wild Man?
And again, this is one of the stories of the Black Sheep that you think is like, they make this stuff up for the TV show. No, man, this is true. One specific episode that actually reportedly happened numerous times is, according to Hank Bourgeois and Fred Loge, both of which I knew, McGee had the habit of smuggling hand grenades into his Corsair. He would, not just one, he'd take as many as he could carry and stick them in the cockpit of his Corsair. When 214 would operate on what they called barge busting missions, McGee would push his bird low over the water, crank open his canopy, fly over the target, and fling hand grenades out of the cockpit left and right. He would do this consistently, to the ire of Greg Boyington. Greg Boyington thought that it was kind of a stupid, as Boyington called it, quote, a stupid circus stunt, because McGee would slow down to such an extent so he would fling these things out and actually hit the target. And he would drop these damn grenades onto these barges, and they would more often than not detonate on the barge, in the barge, whatever, and cause damage. And this is one of the...
Yeah, but keep in mind, you've got to pull the pin on that grenade. You can't let go of the stick. You're really low, above the water. You go nose down for a second and you're crashing into the ocean. So somehow you got to keep hanging onto the stick and fly the airplane. With one hand, put your hand that's got, you have on the stick, kind of loop your finger through the pin on that grenade, keep the spoon against the grenade with your other hand, with the cockpit has to be open before you do any of this, obviously. And then somehow accurately fling that grenade out, releasing the spoon in such a way that you're predicting the trajectory of the grenade onto the barge, because it's going to continue to fly forward as it falls along with you. The grenade is in formation with your airplane. And this is crazy, but he got away with it.
It is. It is. And he did it repeatedly. There's one recorded episode of him doing it, but the guys I knew that said, no, he did it all the time. And it just infuriated Boyington because he was taking unnecessary risks and doing this. But to Loesch's statement that you related is that if he had it in his mind, he wanted to do something, he was going to do it. And McGee survives the war, obviously, and he's an interesting character. There's a book out called The Lost Black Sheep, and it's about McGee's life story. I highly recommend you read it. I have it on my shelf back here behind me. Really good book, fascinating character. After the war, his life takes several turns for the worse. He was a self-described, quote, adrenaline junkie. McGee briefly went into bootlegging liquor. This is after World War II now. Did some shady work in Latin America that nobody really knows what happened there, and flew with the fledgling Israeli Air Force because he was just, he
needed to
craved that. Yeah, he craved that excitement of combat flying. And then to top it all off, he wasn't a wealthy man. He had some, kind of like Boyington, he had debt issues. When he gets back from flying with the Israelis, which he never did see any combat with the Israelis. When he comes back to the United States, he decides he needs cash and he needs it now, and he robs 2 banks. He's eventually caught, and it becomes apparent that he is the guy that robs these banks, and he serves prison time over this. It's after his time in prison that he comes out, and he does indeed get his life on the straight and narrow. He's released from prison in 1967, and he does turn his life around after this. He lives rather quietly, frankly, for the rest of his life in the Chicago area, and just kind of fades into an anonymous part of history. Yeah, and he's an interesting dude.
He and Boyington were, of course, considered to be the 2 best pilots in the squadron.
Oh, yeah.
Boyington doesn't fall that far; he just falls into the transcendency, into fiction, fictionalizing his own life and story. When the TV show, starts to become a major source of income in his later life, but McGee, it turned into a very sad story.
Yeah. He does post-war, after he gets out of prison, he does reluctantly, almost, because he's ashamed of a lot of things that have happened to him. He reluctantly does reconnect with some of the surviving black sheep, including Frank Walton, and Bourgeois and Fred Loesch, who was the best man at his wedding, or it might have been the other way around. I don't remember now. But and he's a tragic figure in history. And I highly advise you do read the book, The Lost Black Sheep. It's a fascinating book. Back to the war. On January 3rd, 1944, so the Black Sheep, the first 6-week tour is over. Boyington is one of the leading aces in the Pacific theater. 214 goes into a second tour in the Pacific. By now, their numbers are almost doubled. They've got like 51, I think it's 51. Yeah, 51 people in the Black Sheep as opposed to the initial 27. They've taken some serious casualties in this span, but the squadron has doubled in size, and Boyington is now, he's still a major, but he is given, with all his tactical experience, with all his combat experience, he's given more command responsibilities. On January 3rd, 1944, the Black Sheep lead a fighter sweep from their base at Torquay on Bougainville to Rabaul. Boyington was overall aerial commanding officer in charge of 48 U.S. fighters, and there was only a handful of the Black Sheep on this flight in particular. As soon as the Black Sheep and their consorts entered the area, they encountered a large formation of Japanese aircraft that quickly turned both formations into a furball. So this is the proverbial beehive of activity here. As the fight swirled around him, Boyington closed in on 0, opening fire at close range. He brought the enemy fighter down. At that time, it was Boyington's 26th kill, which tied him with Joe Foss. And we're going to clarify this. We've already clarified it in the Cactus Air Force episode. Some of you have probably watched it, listened to it. For those who haven't, do so. But here's the story. So Joe Foss was credited with 26 kills. At this time, the press is picking up on Boyington's "I got 6 kills" and the Flying Tigers, and this gives him 26 kills. Post-war records generally give Boyington 24 kills. The American Fighter Aces Association gives him 24 kills. The Marine Corps, we're all sticking with 24. I believe Bruce Gamble, his biographer, credits him with 22. So 22 to 24. Somewhere in there, but Boyington claims 28, and we'll get to the 28 here in just a few minutes as to how. And almost immediately after Boyington shoots down this 26th, quote, 0, Bruce Matheson, who was flying near him and witnessed the kill, loses sight of Pappy as he disappears into a low haze beneath the dog fight. Boyington's wingman, Captain George Ashman, is killed in the action, and Boyington himself is shot down, and he's taken prisoner of war. It wasn't even until late that night, because again, as I said, not all of the Black Sheep flew on this mission. Actually, I think it was only like a half a dozen or so. It wasn't until late that night that they realized, hey, Greg hadn't come home. Pappy's not here.
Yeah, they remember the time when he landed in Munda and, refueled because he was going to run out of fuel. And they're hoping something like that has happened again and that he'll show up, but he doesn't.
He does not. The next day when he doesn't show up and they start making calls and they're like, is the old man there? And there's like, no, he ain't here. He's never been here. And I'm talking like all over the area trying to find him. It becomes clear that Pappy didn't get out of this fight. So they start mounting a search for, I believe, the next 2 or 3 days, trying to look for him. And they do not find him. He is presumed dead. What the Black Sheep did not know, however, is that he was indeed picked up by the Japanese. There's an interview, a post-war interview, and I want to say it's like right after he got home, that Boyington himself is on camera, and he says that he's in his raft paddling away. He's trying to get away, and he says he sees a submarine coming, and he's like, oh boy, this is one of my submarines, one of our submarines. And as the submarine gets closer, he notices that there is kanji on the side of the sail, and he says, and I quote, he says, uh-oh, Boyington, the jig is up. This ain't good. Yeah, the guy had a sense of humor, if nothing else. The Japanese do indeed pick Boyington up, and they do make him a prisoner of war. Now, for those who are wanting to hear us talk about Greg Boyington's prisoner of war story, we're not going to do that here. We're going to do that, but we're not going to do that here. They knew who he was, right, Bill? Like the Japanese, maybe not on the submarine, but once he got to authorities, they knew who he was.
They sure did. Name, rank, and serial number, and I'm sure he tried following that to letter of the law as much as he could. Now we will talk about his POW time separately, but there's a period of time when he's in this very famous prison called the Omori POW camp. And unlike, it's not like the United States, white collar crime prisons, even though they sent the more well-known folks to this POW camp, the Japanese did. That doesn't mean the Japanese were going to be treating them with kid gloves because they were respected combatants. Not at all. Right. In fact, Dick O'Kane was in the same POW camp, and I think for a period of time, he and Dick O'Kane were actually roommates in this POW camp. I think it was later in the war when the Japanese realized they were losing, and they started lightening up a little bit, not a lot, a little bit, from egregious to merely significantly bad kind of treatment. Yeah. So, that'll happen. But I don't think Pappy had any news of what the Americans were thinking had happened to him until after he was released. Did he?
Right. So. Correct. No, that's 100% correct. He to your point, he did share a cell with Dick O'Kane. He wound up sharing a cell too with another tank survivor, and I want to say it was Floyd Caverly. It might have been Jesse Da Silva, but he was in the same camp as the tank people, and also Louis Zamperini too. And again, we're going to do an episode on Japanese prisoners of war or prisoners of the Japanese later on. But to your point, Bill, no, he had no idea that he was. He knew he was a well-known character in the United States, but he had no idea that he was presumed dead. The United States thought he was a goner. To that end, he had been awarded the Medal of Honor while he was in the prison camp, unbeknownst to him. When he gets out, when he is released from prisoner of war camp in August of 1945, he is, of course, found to be very much alive. And actually, he was in pretty good shape, compared to people like Dick O'Kane who were on death's door. Greg Boyington was in pretty good shape because of his gift of gab. He made I don't want to say friends because he didn't make any friends with the Japanese in there, but he wound up working in the mess hall. So he had access to more of the food than people like Dick O'Kane did. So Boyington initially loses a lot of weight, but he gains a lot of his weight back because he starts pilfering food from the mess hall to eat because they were starving to death. Regardless of this, he is found to be alive, and the news is flashed back to the United States, and that news travels like wildfire. They made a newsreel that says literally, and I'll show it here, Boyington found alive, or Major Boyington found alive. He was found alive in this prisoner of war camp, and it becomes national news to the point where the Marine Corps starts dragging every black sheep they can find all across the country to welcome Pappy home. Now, let's get back to the Medal of Honor story here. So once he gets released and he gets back into American custody, he says with a stroke of his own pen and his own tongue, he claims 2 more kills on that final mission, thereby giving him theoretically 28 kills and making him the Marine Corps' highest scoring ace. Now, truth be told, no one knows if he did indeed shoot down 2 more aircraft. The fact of the matter is that he is credited with not being the Marine Corps' top ace. He's the second ranking ace. He's number 20. He's number 2 with 24 kills, or in some circles, 22.
But in his Medal of Honor citation, I think that they incorrectly write in the citation is a difference between being credited with and what your citation actually says. Yeah, I think the citation claims 26 kills. So right, 28 is wrong. The 26 from his Medal of Honor citation is wrong. Later, they conclude 24. So he's not real happy about that, by the way.
No, he is not. He is not pleased. He's not pleased at all. So the Corps flies Pappy out of the Pacific. And as I was saying, they send him home to San Francisco. San Francisco is his first place he gets onto the CONUS, on the Continental 48. Before his airplane arrived, as I was saying, the Corps found as many of the black sheep as they could find. And they sent these guys from all corners of the United States and the Pacific. They send them to San Francisco to meet Greg when he gets off the bird. So this will show you, Bill, that not only was he a national hero, despite all of his transgressions, and of course he's got the blue ribbon with the white stars on it now. The Corps thinks very, very, very highly of Greg Boyington, so much so that they spend a lot of money bringing all these black sheep to San Francisco to welcome their CO home, and that is exactly what they do. He's the first guy off the plane. He is mobbed by his men, and there's footage of this, and I'll show it. I mean, he gets off the bird, and these guys swarm him, like wolves on a target. I mean, just boom, they're on him. They throw him up on their shoulders. They carry him off, kind of like carrying a football hero off the field. They're doing the same thing with him, and of course he's mobbed by the press as soon as he gets off, because he's a national hero. He's at the status of Dick Bong, and people like that. He's up there in that stratosphere of American national heroes of World War II in 1945. So he's immediately, mobbed by the press. There was something that he had said at some point when after that first fight in September of 43, when he gets cut off and, comes back late and they all think he's dead. And he starts stacking the kills. He starts to get a little, I don't want to say reckless, but he's not reckless with his men, but reckless with himself. They some of his men were worried about him. They're like, you need to take care. And he said, I'm fine. He says, if you ever see me going down, with about 30 zeros on my tail, don't worry about me. I'll meet you in San Diego and we'll have a hell of a party. Well, they didn't meet in San Diego. They met in San Francisco, and they had a hell of a party. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
the St. Francis Hotel housed more than one wild homecoming party at the end of World War II. But I hear that this was like at the pinnacle of wildness. Parties that happened. Apparently, it's still legendary.
From all accounts, it was incredible. I remember Hank Bourgeois telling me. I asked him. I said, did you guys? Was the party as good as it was claimed to be? And he just said, he says, I don't remember most of it. He says, but yes, to answer your question, it was one hell of a party, and it's a fitting end to the black sheep service in World War II that they have that, or rather, let me rephrase this. VMF-214, the original Black Sheep service in World War II. VMF-214 actually goes to fly off the carrier USS Franklin later on in the war, but we're talking about Pappy's Black Sheep here. So the legacy, Bill, they have a legacy that is real, and then they have a legacy that is fictitious. And the fictitious, of course, comes from the TV show, but it also comes from Pappy's book. It's a good read. I read it, multiple times as a young boy, and then for this episode, I thumbed through it again. It's the first time in years. There's a lot of fiction in that book. Greg claims a lot of things that just aren't so. I think he misremembers a lot of things too in that point. And, because of the TV show, we stated this earlier, and the way the TV show portrayed the Black Sheep, which, by the way, Boyington acted as technical advisor for, that actually destroyed his reputation with Frank Walton.
Among several of the Black Sheep, right? Yeah. But no embellishment is necessary. This squadron had 9 aces: Greg Boyington, John Bolt, who went on to become the Marine Corps' only 2-war ace, because he became an ace in the Korean War too. Chris McGee, Bill Case, Mo Fisher, Bob McClurg, Paul Moonmullen, Ed Olander, and Henry McCartney. That's 9 aces. They shot down 97 enemy aircraft with a further 35 probables and 50 damaged. They destroyed nearly 30 ships of varying kinds, and they earned a Presidential Unit Citation. No embellishment is necessary. It's very sad to me that he found it necessary to add more than, if that wasn't enough, he needed to add more. And really, I think that caused him to be disenfranchised from several of his old squadron mates.
It did indeed. But after the show ended, and I want to say the thing only ran for 3 seasons, 3 or 4 seasons.
Yeah,
it wasn't terribly long.
It was basically telling the same story over and over again.
Exactly. After the show goes off the air, the Black Sheep had several reunions post-war, even after the show, and Boyington did mend a lot of those damaged fences. And we're focusing on Greg Boyington a lot in this episode because he's a legend. He's a Marine Corps legend, and rightfully so. He eventually dies of cancer. He goes a sad route, and he's visited in the hospital room by 2 of his former Black Sheep. And in a conversation with him, one of his former pilots gets up in his face and says, "Pappy, get up out of this bed. You're going to be just fine. You've beaten harder things than this." And at that point, Boyington turns to him and he says, and he's emaciated. He's clearly not much longer for this world. He says, sometimes there's things you can beat and sometimes there's things you can't. And this is one of those things that you can't. And, the guys that are in there in the hotel room, brings them to tears because they truly did love Greg Boyington, because despite all his transgressions, despite the stupidity of the TV show, they knew that when it came down to it, in 1943 and 44, he had their best interest at heart, and he did. Not a leader on the ground, but a hell of a leader in the air. And he always looked out for his men like any real, true, honest to God leader does. He cared more about his people than himself. And they knew that. And then, a lot of those broken bridges were mended. And when he did pass away, it affected a lot of those guys severely. He was a loved man. He really was.
I wonder, and I don't know the answer to this. I probably could have looked it up before we recorded today, but I wonder, with all of his drinking and other transgressions, what the Marine Corps thinks of him today.
I don't know. I do know that right after the war, he was sent on bond tours, and the alcohol got to him because, now he had free access. He could do whatever he wanted. He's a Medal of Honor recipient. He's a national hero. People are literally pouring drinks into him wherever he goes, which is music to his ears, but not to the Corps. There were several occasions where he was supposed to do bond speeches, to raise raise money for war bonds. And he was blasted, and he gets up on the stage, and it's very, very evident that he's been drinking and that he is hammered, and he's up there slurring his speech and cussing people out on stage as a representative of the United States Marine Corps, a Medal of Honor recipient. And the Corps decides to medically retire him in short order. So they were not pleased with him then. Now, today, I can't speak to it, but I mean, the fact that he's who he was, a Medal of Honor recipient, a Marine Corps legend, I would like to think that, you know, they could see through some of the transgressions. He clearly, more than likely, had post-traumatic stress from his time in the Japanese prisoner of war camp. I'm sure, you know, he drank partially because of that. I don't know. I didn't know the man. I mean, that's just my guess.
Started long before that, though.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. But that certainly didn't help matters any either. You know, so you know, I would like to think the Corps holds him up in the high regard that he frankly should be. You know, as a combat leader, as a legend, as a maverick, and you know, as a true, you know, combat hero. And he really, really, really was. So, Bill, do you have anything else you want to add to this one?
No, that's again another great story from the war. We, you know, like to say that we stand on the shoulders of giants, but sometimes those giants have very human flaws and weaknesses. We have to take them as they are, not as the legend would make them out to be.
Right. Right. And to your point, I hope we didn't, you know, come across as trying to bash Greg Boyington. Quite the opposite. Praising him for his actions and revealing him for the human being that he was, because we all got flaws, man. You know, we all have skeletons in the closet, all of us. And he's a human just like everybody else. So there's the legend, and then there's the truth. And the truth sometimes has a lot to do with the legend, especially when it comes to Greg Boyington. But he was a human being and a hell of a pilot and a true, honest to God legend who led legends in aerial combat in the South Pacific in World War II. So with that, we want to thank you very much for listening in on our conversation. Please subscribe to the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast on wherever you receive your podcast, and on YouTube, please, as well. Like and subscribe to our videos there if you would. We would greatly appreciate it. If you have a question, send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. Once again, my name is Seth Perrin, and I want to say thank you very much. Bill.
And I'm Bill Tody. We will see you again next week.